That was the moment I understood what my father had been trying to tell me my whole life. Not with words. He was never a man of many words. But with patience. With stillness. With the quiet confidence of someone who has already read the last page of a book everyone else is still arguing about. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Daniel. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer for a mid-sized infrastructure firm in central Ohio, and for most of those years my brother called me boring. My wife called me safe. And safe, in their vocabulary, was never a compliment. Let me tell you about the day my father died, and what he left behind, and what it cost me before I understood the gift. My father, Raymond, passed in late October 2 years ago. He was 81, sharp until nearly the end, and he had built his modest wealth the way he built everything else, slowly, carefully, without any fanfare. He had owned a machine shop outside of Columbus for decades, sold it in his late 60s, and with the proceeds bought two things: a renovated craftsman home in a quiet suburb, and a parcel of land about 40 miles east of the city. Flat, dry, unremarkable land that sat between a state highway and a gravel access road. No structures, no water features. Just 42 acres of scrub grass, clay soil, and a rusted survey marker near the eastern fence line. My brother Gary received the craftsman home, appraised at $610,000, central air, updated kitchen, a detached garage my father had converted into a workshop, in a neighborhood where property values had been climbing steadily for 8 years. I received the land. The attorney read the will on a Tuesday afternoon in a conference room that smelled like old carpet. Gary sat to my left, already dressed like a man who had somewhere important to be afterward. My wife, Patricia, sat beside me in a gray blazer she only wore when she wanted to appear composed. I noticed she kept checking her phone under the table. When the attorney finished reading, Gary leaned back in his chair and said, with a small smile I recognized from childhood, "Well, at least it's something." Patricia said nothing until we reached the parking lot. 42 acres of nothing, she said. That's what he thought of you. I told her that wasn't what it meant. She told me I always found a way to excuse disappointing outcomes. She wasn't wrong that I had a tendency to stay calm when she wanted me to be upset. What she was wrong about, deeply, fundamentally wrong about, was the land. But I didn't know that yet either. The first month after the funeral was consumed by paperwork, grief, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from managing both at once. Gary handled the transfer of the house with characteristic efficiency. He had a real estate agent walk through it within 3 weeks, decided to keep it as a rental property, and had tenants lined up by December. He texted me a photo of the signed lease with a thumbs-up emoji. Gary had always been good at momentum. He moved fast, decided fast, and then moved on before the dust had settled. I drove out to the land once in November, just to see it. I parked on the gravel road, walked the fence line in the cold, and tried to understand what my father had seen in it. The soil was rocky near the northern edge. There was a shallow drainage channel running diagonally through the southeast quadrant. The survey marker I'd been told about was there, orange paint mostly faded, the metal stake leaning at a slight angle like it had been hit by something years ago. I stood there for about 40 minutes. The wind came across the flat ground with nothing to slow it. I drove home. Patricia asked how it looked. I said, "Flat." She said, "Wonderful." And the tension in our marriage was not new. It had been building for years in the way that structural stress builds, invisibly, incrementally, until something gives. Patricia had grown up with a father who wore a watch that cost more than my first car, and she had spent our marriage quietly measuring the distance between what she had expected and what I had provided. I had provided steadily, reliably, comfortably, but never extravagantly, and she had never fully forgiven me for that. When my retirement came, a planned, well-funded retirement at 62, she had expected travel, extended trips to Europe, a condo somewhere warm, the kind of life her sister was living in Scottsdale. What I had suggested was more modest. A good life, I thought, a sustainable one. She had started calling it settling. So when my father left me a field in central Ohio, it landed in the context of a marriage already straining under the weight of unmet expectations. In January, Gary called. "Listen," he said, and I could hear in his voice that he had already made a decision he was about to present as a conversation. "I've been looking into your parcel. Had a developer contact I met through the rental property situation take a look at the county records. I asked him what he found. It's assessed at about $190,000, which is low, honestly, but there's a reason. The soil classification limits residential construction. You'd have to do significant remediation work before you could build anything on it." He paused. "I might know someone who'd take it off your hands. Not for much. Maybe $160,000. It's not a great number, but it's liquid, and I honestly think—" "I'm not selling it," I said. Silence. "Daniel, I haven't had a chance to look into it properly yet, Gary. I just got through the estate paperwork. You're not going to find anything different than what I just told you." I thanked him for the information and told him I'd be in touch. He said, "Don't be sentimental about dirt." I thought about that afterward. Don't be sentimental about dirt. It was very Gary. He had never understood why sentiment and due diligence weren't mutually exclusive. You could love something and still read the documents carefully. In fact, I'd always believed you loved things better when you understood them completely. So, in February, I decided to understand the land completely. I went back to the county recorder's office. I requested the full property file. Every recorded document attached to that parcel going back to when my father first purchased it. The clerk brought out a manila envelope that was thicker than I expected. I sat at a table in the back of the office and went through it page by page. Most of it was routine. The deed, a boundary survey from 1987, a drainage easement granted to the county in 1994, a corrective deed from 2001 clarifying a small discrepancy in the legal description. And then, near the back of the file, I found a document I didn't recognize. It was a right-of-way agreement dated 2003 between my father and a company called Meridian Pipeline Holdings, LLC. The language was dense. Pipeline right-of-way agreements usually are, and it granted Meridian the right to lay, operate, and maintain a natural gas transmission line across a 30-foot corridor running the length of the parcel from north to south. I read it twice. Then I read the compensation schedule attached to it. My father had received a one-time payment in 2003 as consideration for the easement. But buried in Section 7, under the heading Continuing Obligations and Successor Rights, was a clause I had to read 4 times before I was sure I understood it. The agreement entitled the landowner, and any successor in interest, to an annual easement maintenance fee of $28,500, adjusted every 5 years by the Producer Price Index for natural gas, payable on the 1st of March each year for the duration of the pipeline's operation. I sat very still. I checked the recording date on the document. It had been recorded with the county in 2003 and was therefore part of the public record and part of the property transfer. It ran with the land. It was mine. I pulled out my phone and looked up Meridian Pipeline Holdings. The company had been acquired in 2011 by a larger regional energy company, Consolidated Energy Partners, which had since been absorbed into a major interstate pipeline operator. The line, I cross-referenced the routing with a state pipeline registry I found online, was still active, still operational. I drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for a long time. Then I went inside, made coffee, and called the county assessor's office to ask why the annual easement fee was not reflected anywhere in the property's assessed value or tax documentation. The woman I spoke to was patient and thorough. She explained that the easement itself, the right-of-way corridor, was recorded as a separate encumbrance, and that annual easement payments were treated as income to the landowner, not as a component of property value for assessment purposes. She also mentioned, somewhat carefully, that if the current landowner hadn't been actively receiving payments, it was possible the pipeline operator had been making payments to an outdated address or a prior owner, and that establishing the payment chain would require contacting the operator directly. I asked if such payments might have lapsed. She said it happened more often than people realized, especially in estate transfers where the new owner didn't know to look for it. I thanked her and hung up. Then I looked up the current operator, a company called Central Pipeline Group, and found their landowner relations department. I wrote them a letter, certified mail. I identified myself as the successor in interest to Raymond J. Kowalski, attached a copy of the recorded deed, referenced the 2003 right-of-way agreement by recording number, and requested confirmation of the current annual fee rate and the status of payment. I didn't tell Patricia. I didn't tell Gary. I waited. 3 weeks later, I received a response on Central letterhead. They apologized for any inconvenience in the payment chain. They confirmed that the easement fee, adjusted per the PPI formula in the original agreement, was currently $41,200 annually. They noted that payments had been issued to an account on file for the prior landowner, and that, upon confirmation of my identity and ownership, they would update their records and issue any amounts that had accumulated since the estate transfer. $41,200 per year. For a pipeline I had never seen and a piece of land everyone had told me was worth nothing. I sat with that letter for a full day before I did anything with it. I thought about my father, driving out to that parcel in the early 2000s when he was still working, still building. I thought about him reading the pipeline company's offer, sitting at the kitchen table the way he always did with contracts, slowly, glasses on, highlighter in hand. He hadn't needed the one-time payment desperately. He had accepted it because the annual fee in Section 7 made the math work over time. He had always thought in decades, not quarters. He had never mentioned it. Not once. Not to me, not to Gary, not apparently to the attorney who drafted his will. Or if he had, the information hadn't been passed on in a way that flagged its importance. Or maybe he had expected me to find it. He knew I was the one who read the fine print. Gary called again in March. He had a different developer now, he said, someone willing to go up to $180,000 if I moved quickly because they had another deal they were weighing. I told him I wasn't interested in selling. "You're being stubborn," he said. "I'm being thorough," I said. "Those are the same thing in your case." I let that go. It was Patricia who broke things open. She had been looking through the mail one afternoon while I was out, a habit of hers I had long ago stopped objecting to, and she had found the Central letter, which I had left in my desk drawer without thinking to secure it. When I came home, she was standing in the kitchen with the letter in her hand. She wasn't angry. That was what surprised me. She was something else, something more complicated. She looked at me the way people look at a map when they realize they've been reading it upside down. $41,000 a year, she said. Yes. From the land? Yes. And you knew. For a few weeks. She put the letter down on the counter very carefully and said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I had thought about how to answer this question. I had known it was coming eventually. "Because," I said, "the last time I showed you something I was excited about, you told me I always found a way to make the ordinary sound significant." She didn't have an answer for that. The silence between us lasted longer than any argument we'd ever had. It had weight to it, that silence. It sat there in the kitchen and neither of us tried to fill it with something small. What happened next was not a dramatic confrontation. It was quieter than that, and in some ways harder. We went to a counselor, her suggestion, which surprised me. We talked, over several weeks, about expectations and resentment and the particular damage done by years of low-grade contempt. The counselor was a practical woman who didn't let either of us be evasive. Patricia said she had been afraid, not of poverty. We were never close to that, but of invisibility, of being the wife of a man no one noticed. She had confused noticeability with worth for so long that she had stopped being able to separate them. I said I had spent 30 years being reliable and had felt it received as failure. That every careful decision I made had been treated as evidence of a lack of imagination. That I had gotten very good at being quietly certain of myself because loud certainty had never been offered back. We didn't fix everything. Marriages don't fix in a season. But something shifted. Some hard calcification of assumption began to soften. Gary found out about the easement through Patricia. She mentioned it at a family dinner in April, not unkindly, but with the slightly stunned quality of someone who is still recalibrating. He was quiet for a long time after she explained it. Then he said, "The developer would have found that in due diligence." "Yes," I said. "He would have paid you significantly more." "Probably. Or just factored it into their offer without telling you." "More likely," I said. Gary looked at his plate. He was not a bad man. He had just always assumed that because he moved faster, he saw more. It was an honest mistake, but it was his, and I watched him own it that evening without me having to say a word. I did not sell the land. I contacted an attorney who specializes in energy rights, a referral from a colleague I'd worked with in my engineering days, and we spent 2 months reviewing the full history of the pipeline corridor, confirming the fee schedule, and establishing a proper payment arrangement with TransCentral going forward. The attorney also identified 3 years of back payments that had gone to an escrow account after my father's estate entered probate. When they were released, that came to $123,600. I hired a land surveyor to walk the full parcel with me and identify its actual development potential. The soil remediation Gary had mentioned was real, but localized to about 6 acres in the northern section. The remaining 36 acres, she told me, were suitable for agricultural lease and potentially for a small solar installation depending on zoning, both of which the pipeline easement terms did not prohibit. I began looking into both options. The land my father left me was not glamorous. It didn't have a view or a story that anyone would immediately recognize as valuable. It required patience to understand. It rewarded the kind of attention most people don't want to pay. That was the inheritance. Not just the acres. Not just the pipeline check that arrives every March. The actual inheritance was the lesson he'd spent his whole life modeling. That value doesn't announce itself. That the people who find it are almost always the ones willing to be still long enough to read what's actually there. My brother called last fall to ask about leasing the northern acreage for a small operation he was considering with a business partner. I told him I'd look into it and get back to him. I haven't decided yet. I'm taking my time. I told Patricia about the solar inquiry over dinner one evening, walking through the numbers the way I always do, methodically, with a lot of context she sometimes finds tedious. But that night, she didn't look at her phone. She asked questions, real ones. She asked about the zoning process and how long permits typically took and whether the lease payments would be fixed or indexed. She asked the right questions. I don't know exactly where we land. I know what I have. I know what it's worth, not just in dollars, though the dollars matter and I won't pretend they don't, but in the confirmation of something I had believed for a long time without sufficient evidence. That patience is not passivity. That reading carefully is not the same as thinking slowly. That the man in the room who says the least is not always the one who understands the least. My father knew that. He left me 42 acres of proof. I walk the fence line a few times a year, usually in the early morning when the light is still flat and the highway traffic is thin. The survey marker is still there, a little more weathered now. I've started thinking about what to do with the northern acres. The remediation timeline, the cost, the options it opens up. I'm in no hurry. I have time. And for the first time in a long time, I have the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the people who counted me out did so because they were watching the wrong thing. They were watching me for flash, for speed, for the kind of visible ambition that makes for good dinner conversation. They weren't watching my hands. They weren't watching what I was reading. That was their mistake to make. I let them make it. And then I went back to the documents.